Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Talking Wild. I'm your host, Stefano Daza, and I'm so excited to have you here for episode 2 of our Zeyba podcast. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you enjoyed our first episode and would like to support our podcast and our other conservation projects, head over to zeybaapparel.com and shop your favorite Zeyba merch. Also, Talking Wild episodes can now be streamed on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Breaker, Radio Public, and on our Zeyba Untamed YouTube channel, and we will continue to add our podcast to other listening platforms as we grow. Okay, so on today's episode, I'm joined by my friend Monique Sosnowski. Monique has a master's in global wildlife health and conservation from the University of Bristol in the UK and is currently finishing a PH.D. in criminal justice from the John Jay College in New York. In our conversation, we talk about the very relevant topic of wildlife crime and dive into its scope and complexity. We discuss the implications of wildlife regarding coronavirus and the future of wildlife consumption around the globe. Monique and I have a great discussion, so without further ado, I bring to you episode 2 of Talking Wild. Today on the podcast, I have a longtime friend. This woman is incredibly smart, and I'm so lucky to have her on the podcast. Monique, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Steph. It's really exciting to be here today.
Before we get started, do you have your drink in hand?
I do. I've got a nice, I believe, Kenyan Tusker to go along with the talk today.
I have my traditional coffee and rum. It's a good,
very nice. Yeah.
I've been drinking it a lot since quarantine started.
We all got to do what we got to do at this point.
Kind of concerning.
Yeah.
But anyway, today we have a really cool topic to talk about: wildlife crime. I think it's something that's very pertinent, current issue, that's on everybody's mind with coronavirus happening. But before we get started on that, how about you kind of introduce yourself to the audience, tell them who you are, what you do.
Yeah, so as Steph said, my name is Monique. I am currently a PhD student at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice / the Graduate Center, CUNY in New York City. And broadly, I am studying criminal justice, but specifically, I study wildlife crime, and my whole background has been essentially in wildlife conservation work. So it's been a really nice and interesting pivot to kind of take this criminal justice approach to it and be able to focus in specifically on wildlife crime research.
Monique and I met in Botswana 5 years ago.
Yeah, I was checking. It was back in 2015.
When we were doing our internship for Wildlife Act. It was probably one of the best times of our life. Botswana is actually amazing.
Yeah, I have the fondest memories of our time back there, and I just am itching to get back into the field once travel restrictions are finally lifted.
I think some of my best friends that are in the area of conservation I met in that trip, and hopefully I can get some of them on the podcast, like Josie we were talking about.
Yeah.
But to have you on is great, especially as our second episode. I feel like we really upped the ante with wildlife as this topic. So before we get to that, why did you get into conservation? I want to get people to understand what motivates you to be in the field of conservation, even before specializing in wildlife crime.
Yeah, so ever since I was young, just really loved being in nature, and I love being around animals, whether those were, domestic cats and dogs or guinea pigs even, working with horses, donkeys, whatever it was. I just loved being with animals. And I loved traveling as well, and it really wasn't until, I guess, during college that I started, the beginning of college, that I started realizing that you could have a career in conservation at all, or work with wildlife that wasn't just in the veterinary aspect, and that seemed like the most exciting thing that I could imagine, to be able to work with wildlife and to be able to be in wild places and see wildlife just doing its thing day to day, and then to be able to protect it from conflicts with people around the world is just a really powerful thing.
Me, same thing. Like I always loved animals growing up in a farm in Venezuela, and then in Canada I went camping and stuff. But it wasn't really until my first trip to Africa, once I graduated high school, that I was like, wow, this is truly amazing. Like you said, a
Yeah.
wild place. That for me, I was like, I want to dedicate the rest of my life to this cause in whatever capacity I can. Was that the same for you? Was there like a specific trip that really, you know, brought you to say, yeah, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life?
Yeah, I think similarly to you, I know you traveled to the Galapagos as well as to South Africa, and uh, it was in honestly, I think it was like the end of middle school that I went on like a U.S. student ambassador trip to the Galapagos Islands, and that was kind of my first. Um,
Went to
true,
Galapagos too?
yeah, but like a long time. Like I think it was like the summer after eighth grade or something like, or freshman year of high school. It was a very long time ago, but that was kind of like my first truly wildlife oriented trip.
It's
To
an
be able,
amazing place.
yeah, it's like landing on Mars to a degree. Like it is incredible. So I had that experience, and I loved being there and being around these like to me, the Galapagos, again, it's like Martian. Like you see these reptiles and tortoises and just
Sea lions.
iguanas, and yeah, it's just a crazy, crazy, unique place, and that was incredibly special.
Developed a fear for humans because they've been in isolation for so long that they'll literally come up to you
Yeah,
and crazy. It's unlike any place in the world.
absolutely. And then after that, I got this kind of like the real like wildlife itch, and I believe it was the year after that I went to South Africa as well, and basically that was the end of my like sanity in terms of being able to just exist in the city or in suburbia, and I've just been trying to get back as often as I can to work with wildlife because it's something about for me is it was just the African environment, African people, African wildlife that is just incredible, and I just love being in that environment and working with the people.
Something that you can't really explain. You just have to
Hmm.
experience. Like
Yeah,
once you're there, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. There's something magical about Africa and also with the Galapagos Islands.
hmm,
Maybe any really wild place in general that
yeah,
it changes you and it changes your perspective on things and it really like makes you love it for some reason or in
absolutely.
a magical place. It's like an enchanted place.
Yeah,
But okay, so you're a conservationist. You love these things. Why did you choose wildlife crime? That's such a unique field. What? Tell us more about that.
yeah. So it's been a very interesting path to get here. Um, at most points in time, I don't think I knew I was going to be here. I had this draw. I was always telling my mom when I was little, especially that I never wanted to work at a desk. Like I would never work in an office. I didn't want to work in a lab or anything like that. So I knew I wanted to work with wildlife. I got hooked on these trips, and as I started going the first time to South Africa, then again to Namibia and Botswana and back to South Africa. I
Because you
just
took
kept,
you
yeah,
took a
yeah,
like long trip across southern Africa once we met, right? You went on like a
yeah, yeah,
photography.
yeah. So we were working in Botswana, and my dad flew out and met me, and he's an absolute African junkie and genius about
Awesome.
like African political history and international affairs. He's just brilliant. So yeah, so he came out and he was like all for this road trip, and we rented a 4x4 with a tent on top, and I made an itinerary for us, and we just went.
Those
Yeah,
are
it was. I would do if you gave me a plane ticket today, I'd go and do it 100 times over. It was incredible to just be camping basically every single night. Yeah, and to just be driving around with essentially nobody on the roads, trying to, not hit the occasional cattle that was crossing or like an elephant. Yeah, it was beautiful. But like on those experiences, I was just increasingly faced with, I guess what you would say is like human wildlife conflict, not traditionally when we talk about that, at least more like from an academic standpoint, we're talking about human and wildlife living in coexistence traditionally, like being able to farm and not have wildlife raid crop fields or storm towns and injure people. But I guess in this larger sense, you can loop poaching and other human wildlife conflict areas into that. And I was just increasingly faced with that, and I increasingly was just interested in this weird dynamic that was globally happening between humans and animals. And what just came out with such an urgency was that we weren't capable of living sustainably and peacefully together in a lot of circumstances, and that was resulting in retaliatory killings of wildlife. It was resulting in people dying, like I said, from human wildlife conflict. It was resulting in poaching, and that dynamic was just so fascinating to me. Like, we're meant to be, and we have to live on this planet peacefully. We have to. Like, it's just the only way forward, and it's the way we've lived forever. And kind of targeting this, at least this criminal aspect of it, was so fascinating. Like, how people could be killing wildlife, why people were killing wildlife, why people wanted wildlife dead or alive. It's just such an interesting field to get into that once I kind of got into it, I couldn't look away.
So let's dive a little bit into what wildlife crime is. When you talk about wildlife crime, are you talking about poaching? Are you talking about the wildlife trade? What exactly do you mean by it?
Yeah, so wildlife crime, how I would define it formally, is illicit taking, transport, trade, or possession of any animals as well as animal parts that is in contravention of any foreign or domestic laws and regulations. So that's obviously a very formal definition. More informally, it is whether you are, whether you said poaching, so whether you are killing animals, whether you're taking animals and trading them, whether you're keeping animals illicitly, whether you're hunting without permits or, not in legal seasons, any of that falls under this umbrella of wildlife crime that I think people, just because of how it is portrayed, what gets to the media, I guess, is traditionally the trade aspect of it.
Right.
And
ivory, rhino horn.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of gets, it is this parallel definition almost to wildlife crime for most people, but wildlife crime is definitely more broad than that, and it is more broad than just, ivory and rhino horn. There's trade in pets, there's trade in flowers, there's trade in, timber, there's fishing crimes, there's all of that, and that all falls under wildlife crime. And it is happening globally, whether you're US, Europe, Africa, Asia, like anywhere, we're experiencing this.
And it's huge. Like we were talking about this, it's what, the third or fourth largest illegal trade after drugs, weapons, and then human trafficking. Trafficking, wildlife crime are interchangeable depending on the metrics, right?
Yeah, so those are like the top four transnational, crimes that are happening. And wildlife crime or wildlife trade specifically, is worth like $20 billion annually. So it's an enormous enterprise.
Who is profiting from this? Who are the players in wildlife crime? Is it everyone? Like every country has some part to play, or is there major hotspots? And where are these these animals or these plants going? What markets are they entering, and from where?
Yeah, so surprisingly to many people, the U.S. is actually the second largest consumer of illegal wildlife products after Asia. Yeah, so the U.S. is actually a massive consumer of like a domestic market for wildlife trade here.
Like what specifically, do you know what specifically is coming into the U.S.? Because you don't typically think of the United States as, being a huge market for wildlife.
Yeah, we get everything, honestly. We have, again, traditionally you think of ivory and rhino horn. We have markets for those, although they are not by any means the largest. We know Asia is basically the largest market for those products for a number of reasons. But we have a massive pet trade. People really enjoy exotic birds, exotic reptiles, whatever you can really have at home.
Exotic pets?
Yeah, I was going to say exotic cats as well. So we get a lot of things. We get a lot of illegally caught or IUU fish that are brought here. So that's illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing activity. So we get a lot of that. We really kind of get a little bit of everything across the board.
And what's the enforcement like to mitigate wildlife crime happening in the United States? Is there any sort of system put in place to prevent it, or is it just completely, Wild West out here? Nobody sees what's coming in and out from the ports.
So the main entity charged with kind of managing wildlife imports and exports in the United States is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they do enforce all of our wildlife laws, whether those are domestic laws such as the Lacey Act and the Endangered Species Act, and within that kind of the international regulations such as CITES, which is the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species on a global scale that is enforced domestically via Endangered Species Act. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife does have inspectors at ports of entry, and they're constantly trying to, detect and enforce all wildlife-related crimes that are happening. But it's a massive, massive job to do that, given that it is such, like I said, globally it's a $20 billion enterprise. So that's a lot of stuff coming in and out. And even though it is amongst the top 4, illegal enterprises in the world, it hasn't been getting kind of the funding and attention that it needs to be fought off effectively, really.
And where are these things coming from? Is it mostly South America and Africa, or is there other places too?
So wildlife just come from every single corner of the world, and we see imports coming from absolutely everywhere, whether we're looking at imports to the U.S. or imports to Europe. Your more exotic species are definitely coming from more tropical regions that we're familiar with. So yeah, whether that is like Central and South America, or most places across Africa. I know that.
Like pets, right? Like the bird trade.
Yeah.
People keep parrots as pets. They're coming from South America.
Exactly. It's a huge trade. Just even looking at just like parrots is an enormous trade coming from the Americas. So it really does come from everywhere. We do get trade from European countries as well. And it is really a question as well of whether we're looking at countries of origin, so where these species were originally killed or captured and traded versus, transit and export countries. So a lot of these products are being routed, through Europe to get to the U.S. or, through other countries to get to us or wherever their end markets are. Yeah.
That's great. It makes me question how these things are transported. Like, how do you effectively, let's talk about like living animals like big cats or parrots. How do you transport a living creature from, say, Africa or South America to the United States while keeping it alive? And, they often come in large numbers. It's not just one parrot. It's usually like many parrots being taken to. How do they do that? How do they I guess it's not safe, but how do they transport these animals alive?
Unfortunately, a lot of animals don't make it during transport because they're not getting proper care. So when you do, like let's say you are a zoo and you are legally transporting an animal across the country or internationally for whatever purposes, there are so many welfare regulations that, address how that animal should be transported, if it should be sedated, food and water. Like there's so much to go in to mitigate the animal stress and everything.
They're not
With
getting proper care
They're not
whatsoever.
getting anything. No, they're not getting anything. And you see with these imports, for instance, they'll export, a couple dozen or a couple, even like 100 birds or something. And a great majority, maybe not a great majority, but, a good number of those they're going to die of stress. You can't just shove them together and transport them in a crate or on a container ship or whatever it is without food, water, anything, and expect it to make it in good condition. So unfortunately, with illegal wildlife trade, there are a lot of casualties with live animals as they're being traded.
So sad.
Yeah.
And who's profiting from this? Is it the poachers? Is there middlemen? Who
Yeah.
is making the big bucks?
It is. That's a complicated question. I know we traditionally think that, for instance, on the ground, again, like in Africa, that these poachers are, profiting and whatnot. But those are the lowest guys usually on the totem pole. They're getting paid for the product, for going in, using their local knowledge, killing or capturing whatever they're supposed to be getting, and bringing it back to be traded. And then after that, like you said, there are middlemen that are then getting money. And with some of these crimes, it is they can be kind of like organized criminal networks. So for instance, with more high value products such as ivory and rhino horn, we do know that those are following the same paths, for instance, as drug trafficking does, and human trafficking and arms trafficking. So once you have kind of those illicit routes set up and, you have some officials bribed or, people are looking the other way or, that there's low enforcement and you can get most things across, why not add wildlife if it's profitable and kind of low risk overall to your portfolio, So it's a very large enterprise and there's a lot of people who from the bottom to the top are benefiting in one way or another financially from the trade.
I've read that even terrorist groups have started across Africa have started selling ivory to finance their arms deals and their other terrorist activities, which it shows you that it's not just, a farmer going out and poaching an elephant.
Yeah.
That does happen. What's scary is that there are super organized and armed groups that have industrialized poaching and
Absolutely
are a big threat.
Yeah, we've seen that. There was a documentary that came out a while ago looking, I believe it was the Lord's Resistance Army, that was using ivory to fund.
Right, that's the Coney 20.
Yeah, I believe Coney was involved in that like with the trade of ivory, and then we know that specifically rhino poaching, which is primarily in South Africa, is very often related to more organized crime.
Let's touch a little bit on ivory, so elephant and rhino poaching, because I know that you've been researching this and the militarization of this issue. From my time in South Africa, I've been able to interview rangers. I've been able to interview ex-poachers, and I guess what most people don't realize is just how serious this issue is. There are people literally dying every day, both poachers and rangers protecting rhino and elephants across southern Africa. It has become an actual warlike scenario, and the stakes are extremely high, right? The stakes of rhino horn per gram is more than gold.
Yeah, so rhino horn is one of the most valuable commodities in the world per kilo. It's insane. It's the same material as your fingernails. It's essentially it's keratin. Yeah. So it's It's wild, legitimately wild to think that that is something that has been created, by humans. So it's worth more than gold or cocaine.
What do people seek these horns for?
So rhino horn is used in primarily Chinese traditional medicine, so TCM or traditional Chinese medicine, for a wide variety of very primarily kind of unproved remedies, whether that's curing hangovers, curing headaches, curing cancer, curing infertility, whatever it is. There's a lot of medicinal products that are coming from wildlife that have no scientific basis for being effective medicines. Of course, that's not to say that, like herbal medicines or other plant medicines or anything are not effective, but specifically when we're looking at things like rhino horn. Drinking some rhino horn, some fingernail in your coffee is not going to cure your hangover in the morning. So it's used for that. It's also used as a sign of wealth in many countries because it's worth more than gold or cocaine. So why have a block of gold or, 2 blocks of gold on your mantle or something if you could have a rhino horn that's worth up to $65,000 per kilogram?
And that's really scary because when it becomes a wealth status or a wealth symbol, then people crave it because they want to, seem like they're powerful and rich.
Exactly.
And increases the demand. Mm-hmm. And specifically for rhinos in particular, there has been a huge increase in the last couple of decades in the poaching of rhinos, right?
Yeah, so there has been an increase, and again, I believe it's like 80% of the world's rhino population does live in South Africa specifically. So South Africa is really, really targeted in terms of rhino poaching. If you want a rhino, if you want to see one as a tourist, if you want to kill one as a poacher, you're going to find them primarily within South Africa. And we have been seeing for a while this poaching continuing. And I believe Kruger in this past year was saying that poaching was potentially going down in terms of raw numbers. But there has been a lot of questions raised as to what the population of rhinos actually is in Kruger, to be able to really tell whether this, decrease potentially in the raw number of rhinos poached is an actual decrease in poaching, or if, we just don't have enough rhinos to kill to have that number be large. So
terrible.
Yeah, it's a really scary dynamic.
Reserves across South Africa are so careful with their rhinos that a lot of them don't even announce that they have rhinos.
Correct.
Because they're afraid that they're going to get poached. And I know that at least private reserves oftentimes are a little bit more profitable and have the resources to protect their rhinos, whether it be by private protection services like rangers or fences, than wild rhinos in national parks and stuff. But the rhino population has been absolutely devastated, and so have elephants across the continent of South Africa for their ivory. And their ivory, correct me if I'm wrong, is used for a different purpose. It's more of a decorative, like trinkets and stuff of that nature.
Exactly. It's not really used in medicine. It is primarily carved or just polished and used as a status symbol, which makes it, to a degree even more outrageous to have such a high value, and for people to be risking their lives to kill them, for rangers to have to risk their lives to protect them, just for someone to display it at home.
And we've actually been able to start seeing the effects of this poaching across elephant populations in Africa as you see less and less elephants with tusks or big tusks. The death of so-called big tuskers, because they're being selected for. They're being selected from poachers. And now the elephant populations that you see are, males with no tusks or small tusks or deformed tusks. And it's having a visible effect on elephant populations, and that's crazy. Just to
Yeah.
see selective pressures happening real time, um,
Hmm.
and things that aren't just these tusks aren't just for decoration. They serve mating rituals. Males fight over it. It shows you the health of individuals. So it's really sad to see it actually happening. But if there's a silver lining, right, it's that elephants are adapting to us and evolving to not have tusks in order to survive, which is kind of
Crazy.
a silver lining in it.
It shows you how resilient nature is. We come in with guns, and we come in with our development of cities and everything, and nature adapts. I mean, New York, Manhattan alone has, I believe, more wildlife, more species than I think it's Yosemite National Park. So, I mean,
Really,
like, yeah, wildlife adapts. It makes it work, one way or another. So to see elephants, studies have shown that they were even kind of converting to nocturnal practices, because they knew that people were active during the day, so they weren't very safe, and at night they could move around more safely. So to see animals that are that intelligent, truly just intelligent, and be able to assess that danger and then adapt is, to me, it's one of the most incredible things, and it just shows us as humans that they're so valuable, and that we need to be protecting them and figuring out a way to live in peace with them, as opposed to be killing them for their tasks.
you know. Let's talk a little bit about pangolins. How much do you know about pangolins?
A bit, yeah.
So, aren't these guys the most traded animal in the world?
Yes, they are, and they are also absolutely adorable,
Great.
and extremely elusive.
Really?
Extremely elusive. Yeah, I mean, people will go around and, not be able to see one for years, even working as a guide and being in the field every single day.
We're
Um,
seeing one wild.
yeah, nor have I. Like, they're so hard to spot. But they're essentially, for those of you who don't know, these like really cute scaly anteaters that essentially look like they're wearing a little body of armor, of little armored scales, and they have really, really long tongues and eat ants and other insects. And they're just sweet and harmless, and now might be, we're still waiting on results, but might have been that animal from which bats transmitted the coronavirus that we're now dealing with. So they've gotten a
Yeah.
little bit more spotlight recently in terms of what's been going on with them.
What do they think? Do they think that the virus jumped from a bat to a pangolin, and then the pangolin was consumed, and that's how coronavirus started spreading? Or was it direct? Was it that the pangolin had coronavirus and then spread it to humans at a wet market?
So I think there's a couple of stories going on right now, and it's just so hard to, figure out exactly what's going on, because we don't have, we can't go back in time and figure out exactly what happened. But I believe just from the genetic testing that they were doing, the story was, or it still is, that it was essentially, at first the coronavirus was in a bat, and then at the wet markets in Wuhan, potentially transferred to a pangolin, and then that pangolin was consumed, I believe. And that's how it transferred to humans. And again, there's still studies being done on this. It's not like a 100% thing. Nobody's positive as to how this happened, but based on genetic tests, there is a high likelihood, it seems, that's kind of how we got into this pickle that we're currently now facing.
I've always thought of it as kind of the revenge of the penguin.
Yeah.
For years, pangolin populations in Africa and in India and Asia, because they're found elsewhere,
Mhm.
have been absolutely decimated. Absolutely decimated. They're being consumed for their scales, right? Their
Yeah.
scales are being eaten. I don't know if they think it has like magical properties or if they're just a delicacy, but these poor little creatures are the most trafficked animals in the world, And how crazy is it that they might be the reason that coronavirus broke out and is now causing all the upheaval that coronavirus is causing? I
Yeah,
think it's crazy.
it's it's interesting for sure. It's an interesting dynamic to kind of pick into. And again, it's one of those things that just tells you that, nature has its way, and that we as humans need to figure out how to deal with it, and coexist. Because if we're stupid about it, then it will come back and bite us in the butt. And again, you see places even like Chernobyl that have had the worst of human impacts, starting to come back with wildlife and biodiversity. And that just kind of proves that, again, nature is incredibly resilient. It'll be here, it'll be here before us, it'll be here after us. And we are nature as well. So we just need to recognize that and figure out how to best live, and not have these issues happen, because diseases come, I think it's about 60% of all human disease originated in animals. So it's a big deal. And again, for it to be such a crime, and for it to not have the attention, and for conservation to be primarily donor based, fundraising efforts only, instead of, state sponsored or anything like that, is in my opinion, like, really not the most sustainable model, for the future. But we'll see how things change. I'm hopeful that coronavirus on a global scale will kind of flash that red siren of, hey, like, we need to do something, and we need to do it now, or else we're going to be living in this, quote, new normal, for longer than we want.
I really do hope that coronavirus has sparked or will spark some change when it comes to conservation.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. The vast majority of these outbreaks that we experience, like coronavirus and SARS, were started from animals, zoonotic diseases. And these wet markets, which I think we should touch on right now, have been a hotspot for disease. And if you see these wet markets, it'll be no surprise as to why. There are animals from all over the world stacked in tiny cages on top of each other, pooping and peeing over themselves, and then in close confinement, right? And then you have millions of people walking through these markets and then consuming these animals. It's absolutely no shock that you would get disease from a place like this. And we've had it before, right? We've had SARS, they think, was started in a wet market. And even with poultry, like bird flu, we know that animals are carriers of disease. Why have these wet markets not been shut down? Why are they still allowed?
So that's an interesting question, and it's definitely one that's been thrown up into this political discussion right now, around COVID, and what to do. So in Africa, and again, that's very broadly to say, like, in Africa, but there is more traditional bushmeat hunting that does go on, and the consumption of wildlife that can be sustainable, that can be managed effectively, and that may be a sustainable livelihood, or, a means of nutrition for people.
By no means saying that all animal consumption is bad, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so the problem really kind of starts happening, like you said, when you start mixing animals from, different ecosystems with livestock, with people in unsanitary conditions. I mean, imagine just people being together, not bathing, not being able to manage your hygiene, with other people pooping there's no toilets, like, for animals. So when things aren't sanitary, that's kind of asking for a disease to happen. So when you get into these conditions, it starts getting really dangerous. And there has been talk, especially I believe it was in China with the wildlife laws, that they were looking at the farming of wildlife and the sale of wildlife as kind of this livelihood practice that would help lift individuals out of poverty. And this was all actually banned in 2013 after the SARS epidemic broke out for, I believe, only a couple months. And then the ban was lifted, and
Really?
and then everything kept going.
So what exactly was banned? Was it wet markets or just the farming of wild animals?
I actually don't know the specific details. I know that like the wildlife, I believe it was, like just the whole farming and sale in wet markets. Again, I apologize if I'm wrong about that, but that was banned and then all lifted. So, the wet markets kept continuing. And again, like, even the definition of wet market is so complicated to get into because unfortunately people do have slightly different definitions. And we see individuals defining wet markets as well as, just markets that are wet because they're selling fruit that keeps getting, water put on it and everything. So when we're talking about this, it really is just specifically talking about these animals, particularly live and dead, that are mixed together in unsanitary conditions. And again, like not just domestic, but domestic and wild. So that was banned. And then this ban was lifted, and then now I believe at the end of February, China banned wet markets again. But but there's a lot of kind of question whether this ban is going to stick, whether it's going to go into law. Yeah, I know. You're telling me. It would be really, really something if it did. So we're kind of waiting to see whether it's enforced effectively, whether it is a permanent ban, and how we do move forward with that. But it is a very complicated issue, and that there's a lot of sides to it when it comes to human livelihoods and nutrition and wildlife trade and disease. It's just a very complicated issue. That needs a lot of time and consideration to work out appropriately.
I don't think it's just the illegal wildlife trade that should be, questioned, but also the legal wildlife trade. I've read that there's not really a lot of monitoring about the legal trade of animals that comes in. For example, like frogs that are used for frog legs are, these bullfrogs are coming in from abroad and transmitting, what is this new virus that's wiping out amphibian populations?
Chytrid fungus, is decimating them on a global scale.
And, this fungus is making its way into the United States legally and wiping out entire populations of amphibians. It's
absolutely
incredibly discriminate about who it targets, and it's literally putting thousands of species at risk of extinction, or has already caused them to go extinct. 100% because of legal trade. So if there is anything that I hope comes out of this, it's stronger protection methods about wet markets and the legal trade of wildlife, also the illegal trade of wildlife, and just kind of the societal recognition that we need to respect nature, and incessant consumption has massive risks. And I don't know how many times this has to be drilled into us for us to finally get it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's one of those things that I'm sure everyone in the conservation and any wildlife or even public health sector is really hoping for, is kind of one of the positives that comes out of all the suffering that so many people are going through right now with COVID. So yeah, if there is policy to be enforced right now or to be put into action, like right now is the time to really get on that, and to do our best to make a change so that we don't experience what we're experiencing right now again. And again, it's not just about disease, it's about all the things from, just pure the removal of biodiversity in wild places that completely disrupts ecosystems, disease. It's about the human losses, whether it's, again, human-wildlife conflict related or the rangers that are dying on the front lines. I think there's about 100 reported ranger deaths per year. And those are just reported. So obviously not all places have reporting capacities or just in generally report. So what we know is that there's 100 being killed every year. And, we do see a lot of that on the news with even just Virunga National Park and the conflict that goes on there. Right. So it's a massive issue, and it's so complex and multifaceted, and it's not just like a save the animals or it's just public health. It's all fronts, and it's really just about us as a human society being able to live in respect, healthily with like on the planet that we are finding ourselves on, and with everything else that's on this planet with us.
I think you just brought up a super important point. Oftentimes conservationists and environmentalists are seen as a side hobby, like not really, like let's protect nature and wildlife for their intrinsic value, not really for the value that they provide to the rest of us. But if coronavirus and, global pandemics in general have taught us anything, is that when we mess with the natural world, it has very real societal and economic consequences, that if we had had the systems in the first place in place to prevent it, we wouldn't have, endured so much suffering, economic and loss of life as we did, unfortunately, because we didn't, invest enough in prevention or in screens or in all this sort of stuff. So again, like, conservation isn't only about protecting nature for
absolutely
sake, is obviously important, but it's also protecting us in a way. And I really do hope that from coronavirus that is something that governments take away. So finally, in conclusion, I just want to ask your thoughts about where you see wildlife going in the future. And I know it's really tough to predict, and coronavirus is probably throwing a wrench in all of it, but what are some trends that you have observed in your studies, and where do you see this trade or these activities going moving forward?
I do think coronavirus is really making everyone suddenly look at wildlife, as opposed to just those who are interested in wildlife, who particularly like nature, or animal welfare or whatever it is. But now it's absolutely everyone on Earth is feeling the effects of kind of living irresponsibly with wildlife. And, people say that to be a conservationist, you have to be an optimist. As we're constantly fighting battles and losing animals, and there is a lot of kind of gloominess to it, that you have to look beyond. But I do think right now we really are at this fork in the road and it's something that we've kind of been, in my opinion, fighting for a while, of what are we going to do in terms of conservation, and what's our end goal here. And one of those is to kind of just forget about it, to not fund it, to, let it be, and to continue living increasingly irresponsibly almost with nature, and to not have conservation areas, to not have law enforcement in that area or anything. On the other hand, like we said, there is this hope that coronavirus is going to draw attention on a global scale, on a policy scale, on a government scale, funding, donors, everything to conservation. And I really do think that's where we're going. Again, I think it's just beyond, at this point, being optimistic about it. I do think that we're seeing, because it is having an effect on public health and on global economies, and it's not just about intrinsic value of nature, that we are going to increase investment. And if quarantining around the world has taught us anything, it's that we freaking love being in nature, most of us. Like, you don't have to want to hike the Appalachian Trail, but like just go, like being in local parks and being amongst trees and grass and flowers and watching spring. Yeah, listening to birds, watching spring come in. Like, we inherently love nature. And I think that, again, like now people who didn't have a focus on nature are starting to think twice about it. And I think that'll lead to hopefully increased, once travel bans are lifted back up, but like increased tourism and increased outdoor activities. And I do think that we'll see conservation go in a very positive direction. I think I really do think people inherently love nature, and when they're faced with nature one-on-one, there is this desire for us to like be amazed, like be peaceful and be amazed by it. And I think that we can continue on that road and see even more tourism to places all over the world. To see wildlife and photographic safaris and all of that, hopefully overtaking what we're seeing with poaching and the loss of the tourism sector around the world. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
I really do hope so. And one last question is, I just thought about this right now.
Yeah.
How can everyday citizens help with the trade, with the illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime? Are there any tips and suggestions that you tell people that are just normal people that want to help out and see the end of this?
I think the very first thing to do is what you're doing now. So just be more informed. Really, like, think when you're dealing with anything that's wildlife related. So some of my recent work covered the luxury fashion sector's use of wildlife products. And it's one of those things where even these luxury brands are ending up importing, intentionally or not, endangered species products. And it's so, like, when you go to a store and you see something that's wildlife, like, think twice and ask, where it's coming from and what impact that might be having on local ecosystems, and then act accordingly and help enforce, not even enforce, but like help set forth policy, if there is policy out there that hopefully will be coming out with COVID. Like, just send that email to your local representatives. Yeah, it's like you get those emails all the time from foundations that are trying to set forth policy. Just support them when you can. It doesn't take more than a minute sometimes to put your name on a list to say that somebody cares, and that something should be set forth. So just think, be educated, share your what with people around you. And then, you're doing the best you can on a day-to-day basis to just live responsibly and sustainably with nature.
I think that with the sheer size of this industry, it's inevitable that you will, or come in contact with it at some point or another, whether it be at a market, at a pet store, at
Absolutely.
a fashion store,
at a fish market, anything. Like, when you're buying dinner, just look. Like, there are, I think, the Marine Stewardship Council MSC certification. That fish goes through specific regulations and oversight to make sure that it has been sustainably harvested. So it's those little things. Like, it doesn't have to be anything big. We're just asking that you pay attention and those little decision points on your day-to-day life about it.
Certifications are huge.
Yeah.
Well, Monique, thank you so much. It was an incredible talk about a super important topic. I'm so glad that you were able to come on and, tell us a little bit more about wildlife crime and wildlife trade. So thank you so much.
Well, Steph, it's been such a pleasure to chat about all of this. It's always fun talking to you. So I really appreciate you having me on. And I hope that all the listeners out there have learned something and have found this interesting.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. See you later.
Of course. Bye, Steph.
Join us on future episodes of Talking Wild every Monday as we have more fascinating guests join us to talk about everything nature, wildlife, and conservation. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking and sharing. And if you'd like to support Zeyba, head over to our website at zeybaapparel.com to shop your favorite Zeyba merch. Thank you for joining us, and remember to stay wild.